So I just want to make sure I emphasize the psychological difference that you describe between like the Western mindset and what's much more common inside China. And it struck me as like, I grew up in the West in psychology of like individual prosperity, right? Versus maybe a larger goal in China would be collective stability, right?
Exactly. By the way, and the word that they use more than any other word is harmony.
Harmony. Sure. Yeah, exactly. Great. Yeah. And hard for a Western to wrap their mind around that. So for the next few questions, I'm going to try to step outside of my lens and do my best. But you also mentioned the work ethic issue a few times. And again, a natural behavior in the varying stages of empire. When you move from being poor and you're poor, you work really hard, you get a bit of wealth, but you still think like you're poor. That's a great place to be, right? Versus when you've been wealthy for a while and you're wealthy, you get a bit complacent, you work less hard, you become a bit poorer, but you still think you're wealthy. And that's maybe a bit of a couple labels we could put on the two different cultures right now in terms of where they're at in their various stages of growth. Back to a couple of things you said about electric vehicles, and this is just market competition. This is not a war. Don't make it more than it is. And so let's look at the trade competition maybe similarly. And specifically, what I'd love to know is, the U.S. is playing this game of tariffs, no tariffs. Let's make a deal, right? And one of the hot spots of activity seems to be the ASEAN countries, the 10 countries that make up Southeast Asia, and nearly 1 billion people, like 700 million people. Not lost to me that President Xi is making a tour of those countries right now. He's in Hanoi. He's going to Malaysia. He's going to Cambodia. I don't think he's going into Indonesia, but I want to talk about Indonesia because I think you're becoming involved in a sort of soft. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Love to talk about that. So here's my question. You could be complacent and a pacifist, but if there's somebody else in the playground who's being an aggressor, you are forced to respond to some degree, right? And so if the Western mindset is competition, war, we have to win, and the Chinese mindset is harmony, you eventually get to a point where you have to react, right? You've been pushed up against a wall. Your key geopolitical strongholds, maybe being Southeast Asia, are under threat from trade competition. How do you balance those two things, right? Well, you have one aggressor and one pacifist, but eventually they got to meet.
Yeah, this is a great, really, really great question, and very complicated. And there are a lot of moving parts to this. But one is we should understand China's security situation and China's security concern, because this explains a lot of the problems. China absolutely depends on its sea lanes to eat and for its energy. So the sea lanes now are the Indian Ocean trade, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea. And those are lifelines for China. The United States has a military all along the sea lanes, from Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and throughout Southeast Asia, and islands in the Indian Ocean as well. The U.S. actually writes manuals, strategies, books that we have choke points on China. A choke point means you control some critical part of the sea lanes, like the Straits of Malacca in Southeast Asia, or like the South China Sea around the Philippines. The Chinese read what we write, and they see our military all over the place. So they have responded in the last 15 years by building up their naval capacity and their military in the South China Sea. They have militarized these coral reefs, these atolls, and the U.S. points at that and says, you see, China's out to take over East Asia. This is what a wonderful political scientist who was a colleague of mine and who passed away a few years ago, Robert Jervis at Columbia University, called the security dilemma. And what he meant by that was that one side takes an action that it views as defensive and the other side interprets it as offensive, and then responds to that in its own way, which it views as defensive and the other side views as offensive. And the psychology, because of profound distrust, leads to a spiral that can end up in war. China absolutely believes that it's protecting its vital sea lanes. The United States probably believes truly that China is threatening Southeast Asia. This is the security dilemma. I hear both sides all the time because I'm both in the West and I'm in the East. So I hear it all the time. The countries of Southeast Asia say, oh my God, we don't want a war here. This is their main point. If they could have good relations with the United States and China both, they would love to have that. I know it because I advise many of these governments. That's what they want. They want quiet. The United States has huge military buildups all around China right now. Our very anti-communist Secretary of State in he was not yet Secretary of State. He was the leading foreign policy advisor to the Republicans in 1951, John Foster Dulles, coined the phrase, the first island chain. This is a set of islands that starts in the north with Japan and includes Taiwan, includes other islands. And the U.S. views that chain as a barrier to China's projection of power into the Pacific, even a barrier to Chinese submarines entering the Pacific. So China feels it's cornered.
Sure.
And we say, oh, they're a threat to us. My God, this is a recipe for war. Add in one more problem here, and that's Taiwan. Long, complicated story, but China says Taiwan is part of China. The United States says China. You said it when we made diplomatic relations, the one China policy, which is true. And yet the United States arms Taiwan and could give advertently or inadvertently encouragement to Taiwanese separatists to declare independence of Taiwan, in which case there'd be a war. And that war could become a world war. So there are flashpoints in all of this as well. To my mind, completely unnecessary. And incidentally, I want people to understand the asymmetry of our thinking or the lack of our willingness to think from the other perspective. Donald Trump says that if a Hong Kong company has a port facility in Panama, this is Hong Kong, mind you, not the mainland even, a Hong Kong port in Panama, that is a dire threat to U.S. security. And Vice President Vance says the same thing. And if a Chinese submarine or Russian submarine appears around Greenland, that's a reason why the United States must take Greenland. Okay, whatever one thinks of that, I don't think anything of it. I don't think much of it. But apply it in East Asia. We've got military bases, troops, naval fleets, missile systems all around China. And we say, yeah, that's our business. Why are they concerned with us? And so the asymmetry, the inability to think from the other side can get us into a hell of a lot of trouble. And this is really a major point. If we're concerned about a little port facility in Panama, think about how the Chinese are concerned with American military bases in Japan, in Korea, in the Philippines, in Australia, in AUKUS, nuclear-powered submarines being developed for naval bases in Australia right now. And we're telling the Chinese, what are you afraid of? Why do you care? Why are you so belligerent? You know, this is partly a game and partly an unwillingness to think from the other perspective.
Okay. Let me ask you a question about the American mindset then, because if there was a substantial threat to the US dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, that it wouldn't be an existential threat, but it will be a very serious one to the United States. They are far too indebted to allow that to happen, you know? And so is there therefore internally, is that mindset somewhat justified because they need to protect the USD trading rails in order to protect their future in a way that other countries don't have to, because they're not as vulnerable from a debt and leverage standpoint as the United States is?
In a way, yes, and it's a very good point, but a semi-humorous one, which is not humorous, but semi-ironic, let me say, because what you're saying is very astute, very apt. But what you're saying is we're in so much debt, damn it, that we have to keep control because we're in so much debt. Well, okay, you know, if you plead that to the court, if you plead that to the court of public opinion, if you say that's why we have to go to war, whoa, how about getting out of debt? How about more responsible budgeting? But what you're saying actually is right. And Donald Trump, he doesn't like to show weakness, let me put it that way. But this is one area where he absolutely displayed fear twice. Once in last month, he declared, anyone who threatens the role of the U.S. dollar, we're going to destroy. That is not a statement of strength. That is a statement of weakness. Absolutely. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then the second show of fear is when he put on the tariffs, the financial markets cratered, not the trade per se, but the financial markets. And that's real too. The United States borrows from abroad hundreds of billions of dollars. We're running a current account deficit of $1 trillion a year. That means that there has to be financing from the rest of the world of that amount, not all in debt, but a lot of it in debt. And then Trump thinks we have the upper hand in that. We're the debtor. Not only the debtor, we're the debtor and we're continuing to borrow. So I would say in that circumstance, be polite and trustworthy, not be, a son of a bitch who's going to threaten the rest of the world, because they don't have to buy the debt after all. And they can disgorge the trillions of dollars of debt that they have if the U.S. dollar stops being the safe haven. But let me give an unfortunate piece of news in all of this, just in a purely economic side, putting aside all the geopolitics we're talking about. The United States will not remain the key currency of the world. We are moving to a multi-currency world, and we're already paying higher interest rates because of that, because we can't just borrow to our heart's content in dollars anymore, because others are not going to hold all that debt anymore on easy terms. And there are three reasons for that very quickly. One is that the share of the U.S. in the world economy is diminishing over time, and it can't be stopped, or it's not going to be stopped. And that means that the weight of the dollar as the dominant currency has less and less fundamental support. Second is the U.S. very unwisely weaponized the dollar by confiscating the foreign exchange reserves of other countries, by using the dollar as the sanctions enforcement vehicle. We tell other countries, you don't trade with that one, you don't trade with that one. And you say, well, how could we stop them from trading short of war? And the answer is we threaten their banks. If the banks engage in dollar transactions to facilitate the trade we've said is not allowed, we cut the banks out of the payment system. So it's an enforcement mechanism. Well, if you use the dollar that way enough, other countries begin to say, hey, we don't want to use the dollar. We'll settle in renminbi, thank you. We'll settle in some other currency. The third reason this is happening is that the literal mechanics of how you make a settlement, how you make a payment from the United States to make a purchase in Europe, or even a purchase in Europe from a seller in India. The mechanics of that goes through banks, and the banks settle through a clearing system called SWIFT. Mm-hmm. This system is out of date. It's outmoded in our modern digital world. And so it's going to be replaced by what's called central bank digital currencies, where basically central banks will just be settling directly. They won't need the commercial banks to be the settlements mechanism. So for these three reasons, the dollar's unique role is basically doomed, in my view. And I'm a little bit of an outlier among macroeconomists in this. I think it's going to happen sooner than the mainstream. I think in 10 years, the U.S. dollar won't play anywhere near the role that it plays today. So I don't think this is a 50-year proposition. I think it's a 10-year proposition. Then it comes to exactly what you pointed to. We can't just borrow by issuing dollars or low interest debt anymore. We're paying already 4.5%, 5% interest rates on U.S. Treasury bills and bonds. That's costly because we've already run up a debt of 100% of GDP of the part of the public debt that's owed to governments and to what we call the part that's owned to the public, domestic and foreign. That means that each percentage point or 100 basis points of interest on our debt means that the deficit rises by 1 percentage point of GDP. It's a lot. So we're in a kind of debt spiral right now. And unfortunately, Trump and the Republicans, and I'll add in the Democrats too, because they do the same thing. They have their hearts content on tax cuts at a time when we're hemorrhaging debt already. Nobody's serious in Washington. Nobody looks at real numbers. No one looks at real budgets. So they look to their donors, and the donors say, cut my taxes. And they say, absolutely, we want to be in office 2 years from now. We need your campaign contributions. So basically, we're in a debt spiral at the same time that the role of the dollar, like you said, is going to diminish. And we're going to rail against it, but we're not going to stop that.
Yeah. Okay. I know we're bumping up against the clock. I have 2 more questions for you.
Good.
We got time? Okay.
We do. Yeah.
You let me know. All right. First of all, I got to get your thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative. And specifically, I'd like you, because I think you're for it,
Yes.
in favor. It's positive global in terms of global economic growth. And I know you have that opinion from a boots on the ground standpoint. You're not reading headlines. You were recently in Ethiopia, I believe, among other things, visiting with some farmers who are the beneficiaries of this program. How do you balance that with the concept of debt diplomacy and predatory infrastructure lending and this concept?
Yep. So basically, the Belt and Road Initiative is a bit like what the United States did in the 1950s, which is to say our industry, our technology is going abroad, and we will help build infrastructure, power grids, power systems, and so forth, to facilitate that. We did that in the 1950s in our development aid programs. China started to do that basically about a dozen years ago in this Belt and Road Initiative. And their idea is modern infrastructure, could be fast rail, and it would be nice if the United States had a little of that. It could be power grid, electricity. It could be port facilities, and so forth. And China will finance that substantially with institutions like the China Development Bank or the Bank of China or the China Export-Import Bank. And the partner countries will get a modern rail service or a modern power grid. I'm all for it. I just think, gee, that spreads development. It's good for China. They sell exports. This is Chinese businesses by and large. China would like to get its debt back, so it wants to be repaid. I have one piece of advice to the Chinese, which I repeat to them all the time, which is instead of the typical 7 to 10 year loans that they're making in the Belt and Road program, they should be 20 to 30 year loans. Because if you lend to Ethiopia, don't ask for the money back in 7 years or 10 years. That's an impoverished country. It's going to take 20 or 30 years to get your money back. So I do have one, it's not a quibble, it's an advice. This is the first time China's done this, and I'm pointing out to them that the maturity of their loans really matters when you're lending to poor countries, because you don't want to trap them. Now, the United States says, aha, it's a trap, it's a ploy. This is false completely. This is U.S. propaganda, bad-mouthing, PR operations. Why? Because the U.S. doesn't have a program like this. You know, if the U.S. just said, okay, you don't want the Chinese, we'll build the fast rail. Oh, my God. If we only had fast rail, we would do it, by the way. We don't even have fast rail. So, but the point I'm making is that the U.S. has to badmouth this as part of its geopolitical play. I go to these countries, I see the investments, I talk to the governments, I advise some of the governments. This is a good thing. If there is a debt trap, and there has been in some countries, it's not because the loan is bad or because the infrastructure is bad. It's because the maturity is too low. So that's what I'm working on right now, is to extend the maturity structure of this. But otherwise, it's a very good project, and the United States should have a similar project if we want friends and connectivity for our industry.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Now, my last question is a selfish one, because I spend about half my life in Indonesia. That's where my kids go to school.
Wow.
And I was very impressed with some of the moves that President Widodo made. They're the world's largest nickel exporter when he banned the export of raw nickel, not to cut off importers, but to own more of the supply chain and refining country. Things like this I'm massively in favor of. I think it's very intelligent. The press covering the new President Prabowo, has been a bit critical in terms of the expansion of military, the role of the military. There's been maybe some nationalizing of real estate. The headline, the sensational headline has been, we're going back to 1990s Indonesia. We're going back to that Indonesia. Now, I know I believe you're advising him on, it's not a new sovereign wealth fund, but it's close. Is this correct? What's the...
Well, just to clarify, I'm not even sure in the following sense. He asked me as he was coming into office to be a special advisor, and I, of course, said yes. I do all of these things on a pro bono basis because I don't take money from governments, and I do it on my academic basis. But I love Indonesia, so I said, of course, I will help you, Mr. President. Then I was asked to join this Janatara, which is a new sovereign wealth fund putting together some public assets. In truth, I haven't had 1 minute of briefing on this, so I've only said yes, that I will do it, not compensated, on the basis that I'm an advisor to the president, and I haven't heard another word about it yet. So I can't answer any specific questions about that sovereign wealth fund because I haven't done anything, literally, not even a moment of briefing. But I am available to President Prabowo as a special advisor to help think through the economy. Nobody's going back to the 1990s, by the way. Indonesia is looking forward. I'm a big believer in ASEAN, which is, as you mentioned, it's the regional grouping of 10 countries, of which Indonesia is by far the largest. But I want all 10 countries to work together. It includes Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos PDR, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and so forth. I want them to work together. It's about almost 800 million people. It's a fast-growing region. I want them to have an integrated strategy on digital, on rail, on ports, on hydrogen economy, on long-distance power transmission. In other words, to really think like an 800 million grouping of a fast-growing middle-income region, because I think it can be tremendously successful. And it links back to the Belt and Road, because I think the region should absolutely be integrated with the Chinese economy. Not only the Chinese economy, but yes, of course, with the Chinese economy. If the United States were to tell Southeast Asia, hey, you're with us or you're with them, that would be absurd. Of course, they're in East Asia. Of course, they're going to have trade with China. Of course, they're going to have physical infrastructure links, transport links, power links, digital links with China. So don't force that kind of separation and expect anything good to come out of it. But I do know what the ASEAN countries would like is good relations with the United States and good relations with China.
I really appreciate that perspective, and thank you. And it also made me think, just as I'm watching the headlines about U.S.-China relations right now, there's a lot about, U.S.-Canada relations right now. There's a lot of headlines saying Canada's future is with China and all of this, in response to trade aggression from the South. And exactly what you just said, it's like, but proximity really matters.
Yes.
$1.2 billion worth of goods cross the largest shared land border in the world every single day. It's sort of like gravity. That's why that works so well, right?
And by the way, we call it the gravity equation in trade, which is that the amount of trade between two countries is inverse to the square of the distance. And this is one of the established empirical points of international trade for decades.
Look, I know I ran over time. I really appreciate you coming on.
Great to talk with you. Really great.
Yeah, super fun conversation. I'd love to do it again sometime. Thanks again.
We'll do it. Thank you. Take care.